tour of the South with like almost a rock and roll book tour the last week.
I'm basically a rock star,
In
yes.
Dash, how many cities have you visited?
Well, we actually just started last week. So we started in Atlanta. That was the launch. And then I was in Oxford, Mississippi the next day. And then we kind of took the weekend off. And this week, y'all will appreciate this because not everybody understands North Carolina geography very well. But I was in Raleigh last night. I'm in Asheville today, and I'm in Durham tomorrow. So, but I have an awesome van. You should check out the van if you get a chance. And it's like,
it's great.
It's basically the book cover.
It's wrapped with the book cover. Yeah. It's really celebratory.
Yeah.
Before we get into my questions, I just have a few questions. And this book is, there's so much here. It is so comprehensive, and we'll never even scrape the surface tonight. But before we do, I'd like to hear in your own words, if you have a certain passage you'd like to share to start things off.
I'd love to. And this will be a little bit on the long side. It's about 37 pages. Is that okay?
Oh yeah, that's right.
I'll read fast. But this is the beginning of the book proper. It's the opening section of a chapter called Steak Dinners and Grady Moments. And I hope it will give you a feel for the book as a whole. I was a 24-year-old graduate student at an English university, fresh-faced and out of place, when I met my first Canadian over a steak dinner. At least I assumed it was steak. The meat and potatoes dinner meal was what one would expect in England, cooked for too long and with little inspiration. I had known enough about England to anticipate that much, but I had never had enough interaction with Canadians or the idea of Canadians to have any expectations of them. They simply never entered any discussion of any kind in my youth in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm sure there were Canadians about then, but I hadn't ever heard one speak a word of any language until the one sitting across from me at dinner said, "You know, the thing about America is you can travel everywhere and the accents all sound pretty much the same." I was too busy choking on my aggressively unsalted roast potatoes to protest this outrageous thesis with words. To be fair, had I given any thought to it at the time, I probably would have thought that Canadians all talk the same too, eh? Ignorance, it turns out, is no respecter of geography. It is, however, curable. The only problem is that you have to recognize your ignorance as ignorance if you would like to be cured of it. Within a year of this jarring episode, I shared a house with a different Canadian and quickly came to discover that not all Canadians share such a monolithic view of their neighbors. Canadian number 2 was doing a doctoral dissertation on Anglo-American relations during the Civil War. So despite having traveled 4,000 miles to study theology at a medieval institution, it turned out that I hadn't made it very far from home at all. One of our housemates, who was from the home counties in England, not Canada, often suggested we have a barbecue at the row house we co-rented on St. Luke Street. I tried in vain to explain that barbecue is something that you eat, not something that you host, but it was wasted breath trying to correct an English person on how to use the English language. Instead, I directed my voluntary diplomatic efforts on behalf of my home region to disabusing Canadians, English people, and other Europeans of their New York-centric view of the United States and their apparent prejudicial aversions to the American South. In the inevitable event that you should come to the United States, I tried to persuade them. Sure, you should visit New York, but also go see Charleston, Savannah, Mobile even. Everyone goes to New York, but not everyone sees it, of course. More people should visit Savannah and Charleston. Like you, long-lost Canadian linguist friend, you should definitely visit Savannah. Then you would stop saying that all Americans talk the same. Defensiveness is often the default position of Southerners, especially when they find themselves outside of the South, assuming the role of ambassadors for their region against the prevailing prejudices against the place, often correcting unbelievably durable misconceptions by exaggerating the region's best qualities with an almost religious fervor. But both postures reflect the basic "it's not what you think" sort of approach. If even supremely tolerant and overeducated Canadians are prone to those prejudices, then no one is safe from them. And defensiveness was the posture I assumed when faced with what was clearly an empirically falsifiable theory. "You should see Charleston," I said. I thought I knew then what I was actually recommending. Had I myself ever actually seen Charleston? The South, I would come to know later after spending at least 2 decades wandering around its less traveled roads, might not feel quite so homely to an English or Canadian person, or even a Southerner. Many visitors come here looking for something they have already seen, whether in a movie or an in-flight magazine. What many seek is often some version of the Terra myth, an idealized and whitewashed and domesticated rehash of the Old South that makes for attractive book covers and postcards and blockbuster motion pictures, if not for self-informing history. All of which might amount to little more than a toothless fancy, were we Southerners not so obliging in catering to market demand for such manufactured nostalgia, or if we didn't invent the myth in the first place. At the time of my apologia for Charleston and Savannah, I had not seen that much of the South myself, and my suggestion that others do so was founded on pretty slim lived experience. Perhaps I was simply confirming the Terra myth to them, replacing one tabloid version of my region with another. So after the presumably steak dinner, I returned to my spectacularly unfurnished room, silently bemoaning the ignorance of my Canadian colleague, sublimely oblivious to the depth of my own. I knew enough about my native region to balk at the idea that there is only one American accent, but I remained as yet unhaunted by the brooding phantasms of history, my regions, my cities, my families, my own. Thanks, you've been a great audience. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, because that is a perfect entree into my first question, or observation. I think it's rare and unique to have a historical topic, a historical subject that is also timely, of the moment, even trendy in certain aspects. And in this case, this book is so many things. And I'll look into that later about the different, to me, it's part memoir, it's history book, it's part investigative journalism, almost expose. There's so many things going on, but I would argue that the crux is the reckoning of the white Southerner with the troubling legacy of his or her ancestors, of their ancestors, of the South's white supremacist past, and how one confronts that with their own family. And 2 years ago, there was a book that made the bestseller list, and it was made quite a splash. It was reviewed in Vanity Fair, and it was Maud Newton's, who was briefly located here, Maud Newton's Ancestor Trouble. And in that book, it has a similar theme, is where she, from the point of her very violently and overtly racist father, she begins to delve into her past, into the troubling things that some of her, and she wanted to know, where did this all start? And she finds out about her ancestors on that side who owned slaves. She finds out about an ancestor up north who litigated against a Native American tribe. But her book it's a memoir. It's historical, but it deals with history, but it's a memoir, and ultimately very personal, ending with her severing her ties with her father to the point of even changing her name, which is not Maud Newton. Your book, on the other hand, although it has elements of memoir, it is so much more. And you know, certainly a defining event of the book is when you discover that you're well known. I believe it's the cousin of your great great grandfather, Governor Allen Candler, had a primary role in one of a particularly horrific lynching of Sam Hose, you know, an event that is not as well known perhaps as others, but whose the details are particularly brutal. And so that forms the crux of it. But then so much of what's in this book could each be its own chapter, and which leads me to ask, you know, you deal with that, but then you also go back to all the places that you traveled as a youth, looking, you know, for this other, uncovering the secondary roads, and you go into, you uncover similar events in Mississippi and Alabama. You know, reveal the secrets of Charleston that most people don't even know, how the Citadel was started. What made you want to go into that, to that depth? You could have easily taken your own family story and made a book and stopped there, but this is a history book. It's a biography of the South, if you will. So you know, it could have been about Flannery, you know, just about Flannery O'Connor. We didn't know about that. What made you want to go so in depth? Is it because you're a scholar? You know, is that just a scholarly bent? And what I'm saying is, you could have just stopped with the memoir book, but you did not. It's so much more than just you.
Yeah. Well, that's
someone needs to edit my
question. That's okay. I mean, so much of this book originated kind of organically through these road trips that I started with a friend of mine from high school and college in 1997. And really, the book ultimately, as it developed, it became a book about what I did not see and what I continue to be unable to see. So in one sense, there are two sort of trips that kind of are constantly conversing with one another. Actually, numerous trips condensed into one. But what originated for me as a just kind of a lark out of curiosity to discover the South that I was reading about in Flannery O'Connor, who, by the way, even though I grew up in Atlanta, I never heard the name Flannery O'Connor until I went to school in North Carolina for college. And I should also say that at that time, around 1997, Atlanta itself was going through a pretty dramatic transformation after the Olympics. And I actually worked in a bookstore, not unlike Malaprops, that was a legendary institution in Atlanta, and it went under about that time. So we were seeing a lot of things that were familiar just basically disappear. So it kind of began as this sort of just curiosity about the region, and about, is there still like something of this place that O'Connor writes about? Is it real, or is it even, are there vestiges of it that remain? And then that sort of developed into, after going back 20 years later, and photography is actually a key element in this story. I was suddenly aware, because of what had happened, what I had learned in the meantime, and how the cultural conversation about the region had really shifted. I was suddenly aware of all of the things that, not all of them, but many of the things that I didn't notice the first few times around. So the trip aspect of it, the kind of road part of it, is kind of essential to, I mean, it is a metaphor, you know, it's a very rich metaphor for a journey and a development and progress, but it's also literal, in this case, a series of literal journeys across the South that became something quite different than they were when they started.
So many Southern stories, I think, are about that journey, that odyssey on you know, on the road, and the eccentric characters that would become almost guides that you meet along the way. Many of whom show up in this book. And it's interesting, you know, if you could go back to the time when you first started doing this, you know, in your 20s, but it was set today with all the knowledge that we have today. I wonder if it would be different, because I think that this goes back again to researching one's family, one's DNA. Like your elders can tell you when you're young, oh, this important person in our past, or this interesting villain in our past, and you get it, but you don't care, because you're too in your 20s. You're still forming your own self. And I think, do you think that it's almost it takes maturing and getting older and having life experiences to go into the depth that you did? I mean, do you think that someone could, you know, knowing all that we know today about things that were used to be covered up, maybe would they make the same journey, or does it take going back like you did? Do you think that as a, you know, it takes having life experience, your own life experiences?
Yeah, and I do say somewhere in the book that you can't really visit the South. You can only revisit the South, because it is a region that sort of, it constantly offering something to you to be wrestled with. Mm-hmm. And I think there are certain versions of the region and its history and its culture that remove that kind of make the story of the South quite simple and straightforward. I mean, if you're all familiar with the Lost Cause version of Southern history, which reduced all of Southern history to white Confederate history, essentially, and then the legacy of that period, which is 4 years, really. But that is also one of the stories that an example of the way that story is incarnated in the landscape is that when I was in my 20s, Confederate monuments are just everywhere. And it's not something that I even questioned. And when I was 25 or even 30, because it's just part of the landscape.
You don't notice when you see that they're so, you know.
You just kind of assume that they were there. I'll give you another example. Like growing up in Georgia, the rebel flag was part of the state flag until 2001. I just kind of thought, well, it had always been that way, at least since, you know, maybe the Civil War. And of course, it was only put there in 1956 as a response to Brown v. Board of Education. So it's a quite deliberate statement against integration. And things like that began to sort of pop up around me. And I began to sort of think, oh, well, these objects on the landscape have a history. I mean, as individuals, we have a history. And they didn't just kind of come up out of the ground. They were put there for a reason, and by people who made specific choices. And the timing of them was another thing that never occurred to me until we went back after 2018. And then, you know, suddenly Confederate monuments were like visible for the first time, if that makes sense to me anyway. They were no longer just a part of the landscape. And I'll give you one example from the book that is from Tuskegee, Alabama. And this is a good illustration of how the sort of back, you know, seeing it in my 20s or not seeing it in my 20s, and then going back and seeing something I hadn't noticed the first time. When we went in 1997, we did the things you are supposed to go to Tuskegee for. We see Booker T. Washington's grave, his home, the campus, and that was about it. Well, 20 years later, we went back to Tuskegee and came in just by sort of, I won't call it happenstance, but we came in from a different side of town into the actual town of Tuskegee, and which is it's different than the Tuskegee Institute, now Tuskegee University. And there is a square, there's a courthouse square. The courthouse is in the middle of the square, like it is in some places, but it's off to the side. But the square itself is a big Confederate monument in the middle of it. And it was put there in 1906. And again, this is one of those things, even if I'd seen it in 1997, this would never have registered with me. But when we went back, I noticed, this was 1906, was the 25th anniversary of the Tuskegee the founding of the Tuskegee Institute, which was a huge deal. I mean, this was like front page of the New York Times. It was a big kind of gala celebration. Big celebrities showed up for this. And that was the moment when the United Daughters of the Confederacy decided to erect a monument to the Confederate soldiers. And that's not an accident. I mean,
they were using that wave of publicity.
Well, I mean, yes, I think it was like the flag, like the Georgia flag. It was a quite intentional response to something, a very specific movement in history. But I don't know that I can only speak about my experience as it unfolded, and that happened as a function of going back and revisiting. I don't know if I would ever have been. It would have made a much less interesting book, I think, for me, in terms of just writing, to have just like narrated, oh, here's all of the stuff in the South that's gets history wrong, or the things that aren't marked, because ultimately this was a book about me, and it is about the South. Not at the risk of sounding sort of narcissistic, it was about what I was incapable and still am incapable of seeing. That makes sense.
It does. And there's obviously a memoir is underpinning it, but as someone who loves biography, I found myself rereading and searching in the index for passages for some of my favorite people, coming up, about. I think I've known that a real event was the basis of Flannery O'Connor's short story, The Partridge Festival, but I didn't know the details. And I knew something about Joel Chandler Harris, who wrote the Uncle Remus stories, but you uncovered all the layers there. Or, there's Faulkner who comes in, and I didn't. And I think a great point you make about Charleston is that, yes, it's visibly, it's the city that's always called the most beautiful in the South, and it's visibly the most charming because perhaps because it has the most to hide. And even there are revelations. A lot of much of Charleston's darker past and ancient and recent is well known. Other things not so well known. I did not know, for instance, how the Citadel was started, and that was a revelation. But back to Flannery O'Connor. One thing about her that always struck me, and I'm sure as a scholar, you've studied a lot about her, and I think a lot of people love her, but maybe the casual reader may have seen one or two stories in an anthology, and they just know she writes about quirky, freaky people from mid-century Southern Georgia, and they don't understand, or is it necessary to understand? I think she wanted people to understand it was coming from her Catholic faith was a huge part of what she was writing about, and that the redemption and grace was the overriding message of all her stories, no matter how dry and funny they were. And I wonder if that your background and your theological background, all these terrible things that you uncover, the reckoning, the guilt, or the heavy stuff, is there a message of that, any sort of redemption, that's something sort of in that O'Connor-ish vein, like, well, here's the worst that I can show you, I'm showing you the worst, and and we're not going to solve it ourselves type, we're not going to reckon with it. We're not going to be able to justify it in a human way.
Yeah, O'Connor is a very important figure to me and to this book. I mean, many people in here have probably read O'Connor, probably much more than I have. But I think one of the things that I'm so grateful to her for is her utter lack of sentimentality.
Yes.
And growing up in a culture in sort of Buckhead, private school, Atlanta, O'Connor showed, I think she revealed to me a lot of the sentimentality in that world, the superficiality, if that's not too harsh a word, or at least the the tendency to not speak truthfully
Mhm.
about the world and about oneself, and maybe even to mask it with a certain kind of genteel politeness or something. And O'Connor is pretty savage in her treatment of that kind of sentimentality, especially when it comes under the guise of a certain form of Christianity. And as at the time I was at the time I first encountered O'Connor, I had just emerged from a kind of evangelical period. I know that's just like a really bad word these days, but I had, it was a version of Protestant kind of Calvinist Christianity that I had experienced in high school and college. And then O'Connor, like, it was like that kind of life became completely impossible for me after reading her. And I guess to your question, like one of the things that I think animates the way I approach these difficult historical subjects, and especially where it concerns my own family and my own self, is that let me put this in the simple terms that I think is faithful to O'Connor. There's no resurrection without a crucifixion, in kind of theological terms. For her, grace is never this sort of warm, kind of it's comforting even sensation. And that's how I think I was taught it, at least in certain periods of my life. For her, she even describes it in the language of the New Testament as a sword. Grace wounds before it heals. And all of her fiction is ultimately about, as she herself said, the action of grace upon the creature. And one of the things that's so startling about her work is that this is true of with maybe one exception, but every single one of her stories and novels. And they often are accompanied by really disturbing acts of violence. But in the one case, A Good Man Is Hard to Find, which is probably her most anthologized story, the character who's supposed to be the villain actually is the one person in the story who speaks the truth. And that sort of thing is happening in O'Connor all the time. And I know that, like, she is a complicated figure, and she is, there's aspects of her biography that are unsavory and are really difficult to sit with. But I will forever be grateful to her as for exerting that kind of power over, my own imagination. I could go on, but I probably shouldn't, because I could talk about her all.
I like that you brought up how the unsentimentality of her fiction, because I read a biography of her. I think it's Brad Gooch's biography, and one thing that was sort of fun and catty was that how much she dished about fellow Southern writers who are very beloved writers. She had nothing good to say about Carson McCullers, and she said that Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird was okay for children, meaning it was simplistic. Yeah. But and here's where I want to read the passage that I found very beautiful. Going along with the theme of redemption, I think another kind would be the redemption that can be found in nature, in the absolute stunning beauty of the various Southern landscape, in the various kinds of Southern landscape. And there's an obvious love and affection for it expressed in this book. And I think, redemption for the atrocities of humans can always be maybe at least, somewhat redeemed by the gorgeousness of nature or God's creation or what you want to call it. But, obviously the South has its share of these gorgeous landscapes. And I wanted to read a little passage about, I think this in Yamasi, and that's, is that near Beaufort? Is it Beaufort or Beaufort?
Honestly, I can never remember.
Beaufort in the South Carolina, Beaufort, and I can't remember.
Pecan.
I've memorized it and forgotten it so many times. Okay, so this is Yamasi, which I believe is somewhere near one of those cities near the, and it's in the Low Country, let's say. Old Sheldon, southeast of Estelle on SC68, Yamasi is a terminus. By now you are firmly in the Low Country, a dense and lush range of live oak and palmettos. Yamasi is also a railroad town of barely 1,000 people. In the tiny crossroads that form the town center, a railroad depot and a steam engine mural on a building now serving as the holy temple of the Lord Jesus Christ Incorporated of the Apostolic Faith celebrate the town's origins and source of subsistence. An odd proliferation of military imagery abounds here as well, which is explained by the fact that Yamasi was once the last onboarding site for the U.S. Marine recruits bound for training at Parris Island near Beaufort. The Low Country gets lower by the mile from Yamasi as Old Sheldon Church Road passes through a veritable thicket of live oaks interspersed with pines and palmettos. By the time you reach the site for which the road is named, the foliage is so thick that it seems to reach out and grab you as you emerge from climate-controlled comfort into a less controlled environment of dense and humid wildness. A wall of oaks serves as a kind of boundary to the site. At the entrance, like a portal into an alternative universe, one tree is deeply scarred by an open wound, whether from rot or lightning, who knows? The massive scar has been repaired with brick-like masonry in an extraordinary fusion of the natural and artificial. Like Japanese tea bowls mended with gold, it is a kintsugi sort of work in a very Low Country style. Where there was a fracture, there is a new creation. The remains of the church itself are isolate and barren, a shell of a sanctuary surrounded by huge brick columns that support nothing. Instead, they seem only to aspire either to a roof once more or simply to sky. And kintsugi is a form of pottery, right, where the cracks, broken pottery is not only repaired, but transformed by filling it with gold. So that's a huge metaphor.
It is. I mean, it's so rich. Yes, kintsugi is this Japanese tradition of tea bowls in particular, usually heirloom bowls. If they break, they're repaired with, as you said, mended with gold. The seams, the wounds, as it were, are gilded. And in Japan, a broken and mended bowl is much more valuable than an unbroken and whole one. And you can run with that one all night if you want to, sort of, especially the theological implications of that metaphor. And a friend of mine who is a Japanese American artist who introduced me to kintsugi and told me that he heard that in Japan, families will sometimes, if a bowl breaks, if a bowl breaks, a family might hang on to the fragments for generations until they're ready to put them back together. And for me, I felt like that was kind of an analogy for what I was doing in this book. I wasn't trying to reconcile anything in a way. And redemption really isn't even the goal of this book. I simply wanted to gather the fragments because they had been lost, they'd been dispersed, they'd been hidden, they'd been further broken. And so maybe to mend, I should probably shut up because I think I write this maybe better than I can sort of summarize it. But essentially the goal, the ideal or the goal of like mending all of these stories back together in one whole, that's a sort of multi-generational task, I think.
Sorry, I'm still not sure about that.
I'm not sure about that either, but we're going to go. That's perfect.
With stories coming out, with people exploring their past more, I mentioned the Maud Newton book, or other similar stories of people, or even not even people that are writing books about it, but DNA genealogy is such an interesting thing. You never, it's getting more sophisticated all the time. You never know what you might find out about a relative, and it can be great story material, if nothing else. But it's, do you think that coming from such a prominent family in Georgia, do you think that when one comes from a family whose name is well known, there's an increased responsibility for, or maybe not such a heavy word, but sort of, in that vein, a duty to almost own up, or to talk about it? I told my friend who lives in Atlanta that she should go see your opening at that was the Margaret Mitchell House, and I told her a little bit about the background of the book, and she's like, "Wow, no kidding!" She's a little girl. She said, "I have my daughter in the playground at Candler Park at this very minute." So she, So what do you think about that? Is there more of an onus to speak about it, and then especially if you have a background in academia and you have the platform?
I don't know, honestly. I probably, but I guess in my case, what drove me was I do feel like there was a sense of responsibility, a kind of public duty or something like that. But it was also because there was like an inverse relationship between, I guess, how prominent the Candler family was at a particular part, but especially a particular period of Atlanta's history, like from the late 19th and early 20th century, and a proportional relationship inversely between that and the silence with which that covered our history during this period. And I guess what I mean by that is when I write about some of my ancestors and their cousins, and what they were up to in the 19th century, and how, for example, Governor Candler ran basically on a pro-lynching platform, and when the Sam Hose episode, he didn't quite applaud it, but it was pretty close. And when I'm uncovering all of these things, the uncovering isn't really the right word, because everything that I came to learn about my family's history, I learned from the newspaper. I learned from, books. It wasn't like I found some Foot Locker at the bottom of Lake Lanier that had like all of these undiscovered manuscripts and letters. It was all public knowledge. And it actually started in 2017 when a friend of mine, David Moltke Hansen, he lives here in Asheville, a historian, and he told me that there's this book you need to read, and he's the type of person that when he says there's a book you need to read that book. That's definitely on the list. But he said, yeah, it's called At the Altar of Lynching: The Burning of Sam Hose. I was like, that sounds like a really intense book. I'd never heard the name Sam Hose before. And he goes, yeah, your family comes up in it a lot. And I wasn't really prepared for that. But then it kind of eventually dawned on me that like, there are people out there who know way more about my family than I do. And like, who study this stuff, like written books about it. And it's almost embarrassing. But I think what it really spoke to was not that so much as the extent of and the depth of like generations of psychological, mental, spiritual labor put into not talking about subjects that were public knowledge. And that is the phenomenon, the pathos or whatever, that really kind of drove me. And so, I mean, it's kind of absurd, really, in a way. Just like, why pretend these stories don't exist when, like, it seems like a a lot of other people know about them. And there are obviously like layers to that phenomenon that are going to take, sorry to my children who are here, because they're going to have to keep working on this one too, because I think it's a really tough one. But yes, I do feel if there's one virtue I felt like many of that generation of candlers I felt a little bit inspired by was a sense of, I mean, they're very philanthropic people and very generous. And I'm not, running a soft drink company, so I don't have like millions of dollars to give to charitable causes, but I felt like my own sort of, in a weird way, kind of contribution maybe to that family legacy was to at least try to hand on to my kids a more truthful version of who they come from. Yes.
And certainly even, there's there might be the worst person in a family, but there's also so many characters that you want your kids to know too. There's instances of bravery and just general eccentricity coming from the South. And of all the places you visited or revisited, what place surprised you the most? Like, what place did you say, wow, I thought I knew this place, but look how it's changed? Or what place surprised you by being so much more than you thought it would be? I found the portion about Memphis very fascinating. I was only there once, and it was about 96 or 97, and even then people the story about the Pyramid Conference Center, and there was but what place surprised you the most?
Oh man, I mean, there are so many. I mean, in many ways, like my hometown is probably the one that surprised me the most, because it's the one I thought I knew, but I don't really. But if there's one place that my mind immediately went to, the Mississippi Delta, which I find like so mysterious and so beautiful and so troubled and so complicated, and more like of America's contributions to world culture have come out of the Mississippi Delta. And this makes no sense. Like, if you know the history of the Delta, is like serious poverty, serious racial violence. I mean, Emmett Till, alone, and that's just one example. But it's like a paradox, and every time I go back, there's something else that I didn't know before. In fact, the very last section of this book that I wrote was the section on the Delta, because in August of last year, I had just come back from the Delta, and I had to, because of that experience, I had to go back and rewrite a lot of what I had, or add to at least what I had said about the Delta. And I thought, I've got to cut this off, because this is going to have to be constantly be revised, because of this place is just, it's sort of perpetually revealing something to you, and maybe something about yourself. So that's probably why I find it so weirdly appealing.
I think we're ready for questions now.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so remember, take pity on Melanie's memory, so that she doesn't have to memorize everything you say, your preambles and your question deep inside. Let's let the live audience, somebody want to be the point of the spear. And yes.
I have a question. When you write about the past and the present, you must also think about the future. What future do you see for the South?
So could you repeat it, please, Melanie?
He said, when in Pete's writing, he writes a lot about the past and the present, and he wants to know what future what future do you envision for the South?
Man, that's really a good question. I don't know if I have a very good answer, but I actually feel pretty good about the future of this region, if for no other reason that like truthfulness about our past seems to be a little bit more important to us now. And I think, you know, the lost cause version of history that I described, which is basically like equates, and even you use the term Southern culture, it evokes, you know, white men with like pickup trucks or something. And like that's the legacy of the lost cause version of history, which is the South equals white male culture. And that is really boring. Like it is like the most boring version of the South. And so if anything, to be freed of that opens us up to the incredible diversity and richness of this region. I mean, I don't really like, you know, the whole sort of North v South and like how we're better or they're just as bad as we were. I'm not interested in any of that. But I will say that it just is, it is incredible that some of maybe America's only distinctive art forms in terms of music all come from really Mississippi. I mean, Mississippi alone is responsible for so much. I mean, in Louisiana, you know, jazz, the blues. And so I think at the very least, my kids are going to inherit a version of the South that is a lot more interesting and more honest and than the version that I got. That's maybe not much, but it's not nothing.
Okay, so question from the virtual audience. You don't have to memorize these. So question from the virtual audience. Could you talk a little bit about your writing process, please? What's a typical day in the writing life, if there is one, of Pete Canty?
Gosh, no, there is not a typical one. I found that having, you know, 4 boys and at home, you know, many of them were at home during the course of writing this book. You just had to write when it was possible, you know, in the moments. And I actually got fairly good, or at least better at being productive when I had to be, rather than, you know, when I started all this, you know, the life of a writer is like, I'm gonna go sit and contemplate beauty, and then whatever the muses deliver to me, I will put on the page, and that's all. It doesn't work like that at all. I mean, the only thing about process that might be mildly interesting with a specific to this book is that photography was a really essential part for me for the composition of this book, because, and it really originated in some ways with the experience of, like, I had all of these film photographs, film negatives, for thousands of them, for going back to 1997, that were just sitting in a box somewhere. And so one of the first things I did was try to, in order to sort of reconstruct some of these trips and like remember where I had been and remember what these places were like, I went through those images. And one of the first things that happened, I mean, it was like, unlike the experience of being in the Mississippi Delta, is that these images started to reveal things to me that I never saw the first time, which is really just like what the book is kind of about. And it's the form and the content of the book is that experience of being shown something you didn't see. Like, even when I was looking through the viewfinder, I might have thought that this photograph was about, you know, one thing, and it turned out to have been about something quite different, or many different things. And that's one of the beautiful sort of powers of photography, but it's also, you know, just a fact of the world, because the world itself is constantly revealing itself to us. And there is just, at any given moment, there's a potentially infinite set of, you know, realities or truths that are kind of showing themselves to us. It's just that we often lack the eyes to see and the ears to hear. So, I mean, the photography part actually became pretty essential yeah. Other than that, it's just putting words on the page when you can.
Yeah, I wonder if, as a writer of this, you're dealing with kind of the reckoning of complicity, history, whether or not it's your own complicity or just your proximity to that complicity. If on the other side of writing that book, you feel somehow freed, and or if party, and also if part of writing the book is to serve as a model for other people and how they can admit or reckon with their own complicity and get freed from the guilt and associated feelings that they may feel.
The question, he asks whether part of the book is about dealing with feelings of guilt and complicity with the actions of one's ancestors, and if that is purged, if you will, once the book is finished, and also if the book might act as a might inspire others with similar backgrounds to do the same, to discuss their ancestors' troubling actions.
I mean, I certainly hope so. I wasn't, I mean, someone asked me in a previous event, like, who is the audience for this book? And it was 4 people. It was my 4 children, because I did not want to write a sort of how-to that presumes a kind of knowledge and authority I don't have. I just wanted to sort of tell my story. If other people find some value in it, then by all means, I hope it can be you know, liberating for people. That is certainly how I experienced it, though, this sort of reckoning or confrontation with difficult truths of the past. And even with my own family name, like, I mean, growing up with this name in Atlanta, I was like, oh, I just would rather not talk about it. And just like, I went to school with people who I think, well, here's a funny anecdote. Like, when I was teaching in Texas, a colleague came up to me one time and at one of our rare social events, and he goes, and he's like looking around, like he doesn't want people to hear. He's like, hey, Candler. It's like, I know what that name means. And I'm like, well, maybe you can tell me, because I'm having a hard time figuring out myself. And so in a way, like, and it was also like the curiosity of my kids about these people in our past they did some interesting stuff, and they were just interested in them, and they didn't have all of this baggage that I have. And so embracing that actually it allowed me to kind of let go of it in a weird way. So I mean, just sort of owning it a little bit, and then I don't have to like necessarily carry this so much. But I thought maybe I'd read a passage. Chris's question was not a plant, I promise, but that it does. I think I'm better on paper here. So if I can just read a short paragraph that I think answers your question. And this brings us back to O'Connor. O'Connor's work helped introduce me to a South I had little experience with, but she also introduced me to the idea that hope for oneself, for one's city, for one's nation is only to be found in an honest and often violent confrontation with the past, one's own, one's cities, and one's nations. Mythologies may be soothing and even good for tourism, but they cannot save us. O'Connor showed me that there is no future for any of us without a clear-eyed and unsentimental reckoning with our own complicity in the suffering of others, that there is nothing more terrifying, exciting, and liberating than the unlearning of untruths, the dethroning of the self and its enabling illusions, the freedom of spaces newly opened up where lies once were.
We have time for one more question.
I have sort of a question. Of course, I love the food of the South, which I also think is a unique melding of cultures. Barbecue. If you do, what is the best.
Okay, so now you're getting into like really hard, we're gonna get into serious trouble with this one. Oh, sorry.
The question is.
Yeah.
The motif is that barbecue is important, necessary, and what is your favorite of all the versions of the South, the competing versions, and it matters what the answer is.
This is like in North Carolina, yeah, this is like, we could start a war here. I do eat barbecue, and I probably have an unhealthy relationship to it. I love a pork barbecue, and I spent some time in Texas, and it's all beef, and that just never felt right to me. But a lot of Texas didn't feel quite right to me. But man, if I had to pick like some of my favorite barbecue, oh man, I mean, Asheville is very blessed to have some really good barbecue restaurants. Okay, I'll name a couple. I'll name this one because it's not around anymore. Sweat's Barbecue in Swainsboro, Georgia. You used to, like, if you're driving to the coast, stop at Sweat's, legendary barbecue. There was also a place called Chad's Barbecue up, and it was like a tiny little shed, like with what is that stuff called? The screen, the screen around it, and that was up near Gainesville, Georgia. Fresh Air Barbecue. These are all like in Macon, and I mean I could go on. I mean I don't. So I will say this about barbecue. I do not believe it. I mean, having said what I said about Texas, I am a sort of Catholic when it comes to barbecue. I am a Catholic in real life too, but I don't like when it comes to barbecue. I do not feel like one should have to choose. They're all good. I mean, I love Lexington barbecue. I love Alabama barbecue. It's all good. It's all good. And you've really opened up the sort of, man, this is like serious intellectual work here.
Right, that was a artful dodge there.
Yeah, thank
you. I like it, no fisticuffs. So let's do final thoughts, and we're at the top of the hour. So please.
Final thoughts.
Well, there's the gold sauce in South Carolina.
So I don't remember. Did I put this in the book? So I will say one negative thing about, and this comes partly from my friends in Columbia who grew up there, Maurice's Barbecue. By the way, I have a book of photography that was sort of emerged, that contains a lot of the photographs from these trips. I think Malaprops may even have a copy or two. That was a very subtle plug, but there's an image in there from Maurice's Barbecue that I sort of lined up the sign of a Maurice's Barbecue sign, and then there used to be like a Christian ministry next door that also owned by the barbecue restaurant. I mean, this is like South in a nutshell, and it had a little marquee with little lights on it, and it just so happened to line up and said barbecue is sin. And if you know the history of Maurice Bessinger in Columbia, South Carolina, you'll see what that's kind of loaded.
Do we have 3 minutes? No.
Okay. Four.
4, okay.
No, for what?
I forgot something I wanted to close with, and it's the opening. Tell us how you came to get a foreword for your book from Roseanne Cash, because I think that's an interesting, the people, that.
Yeah, well, I mean, so the short version is the first thing I ever published in 2003 was an essay written about Johnny Cash, and it was it was published right after his death, and it somehow made its way to Roseanne's inbox or whatever, and she read it, and she said she wanted to get in touch with the author, and basically, like, we struck up a friendship that has 20 years now, that she's been I mean, I'm very, very grateful, because she's not only an incredibly gifted writer, songwriter, musician, singer. She's just one of the most generous people I've ever come across, like genuinely thoughtful. You can just read her forward and
Just-
be done with it.
It's a-
Well, thank you so much.